Hello and thank you for watching the Angry Rooster Creations channel. Today we've got another fountain pen related video, this one being an ink video. We are looking at 4 inks from the Octopus Fluids Write and Draw series of inks. These are a series of permanent pigmented inks made by Octopus Fluids. The ones that we have to look at today are the Violet Lion, the Pink Owl, the Green Panda, and the Yellow Zebra. And our pens for this video that I'm going to be using, I have 3 Jinhao 619 pens, all of which have the an extra fine nib in them. And then I do have 1 Jinhao 992, which also has an extra fine in it. And those are the these are the pens that I'm going to be using in this video. And I'm going to be doing my writing tests on 4 papers. It's going to be a 20-pound copy paper, sort of as a control, a 50-pound Blick white sulfite drawing paper, a 50-pound Koh-i Noor sketch paper, and a 98-pound Canson mixed media paper. Now, my reason for using those paper choices is I predominantly use my fountain pens for drawing and artwork. And so the papers I'm going to be testing them on, with the exception of the copy paper, are art papers that I would typically draw on. And specifically with these types of inks, these pigmented inks, they're really intended for people like artists predominantly, because they are, most importantly, a light fast ink, which is important if you want to display a piece of artwork that you make with ink. It is very important that it is light fast and fade resistant, so that over time the colors just don't, essentially fade or completely disappear off the page, as can happen with some inks. So without further ado, I'm going to start the writing test with the 20-pound copy paper. And here is the 20-pound copy paper. Alright, that concludes the writing on the 20-pound copy paper. Now, if we look, I'm not really seeing any kind of feathering. Well, if there is any, it only really seems to be, I don't even know if this is going to show up on camera, maybe possibly on the Green Panda here. Could be some feathering. But other than that, on the front of the page, I don't see much in the way of feathers. Now on the back, we got some ghosting. The Green Panda's ghosting a bit. A little bit of ghosting on some of the other pages, but honestly, not really that bad. If you were using this ink on copy paper, I doubt this is really the kind of paper you would be using this ink with, but if you were, you could definitely use both sides of the page here. Maybe with that green, it seems like it got deeper in, but the other colors don't really seem to be showing through much at all. It's not really much in the way of shading. The only one of these inks that I can see that looks like it wanted to shade was that purple. The purple seems like it wanted to shade some. Not a lot. Mostly like in that where fluids, I doubled over that line. So that's part of that. I doubled the line up. And there's a little bit of, at the end of some of the letters, there's a dot where I ended the letter, but not really much in the way of shading. Even in a lot of the scrubs, you don't see much of a shade. Now, on the dry times, it looks like on the purple ink, it was still wet for at least 7 seconds on this copy paper. The pink looks like it was still wet about maybe 5 seconds. The green only really smeared after, looks like 2 seconds. So it seems like it dried a little faster. And The yellow, it's hard to tell because the smears are so light. Maybe 4 seconds. Now some of that could have been pressure on the pen when I was writing, possibly making the pen flow a little wetter, drier, etc. But generally speaking, so far with these inks and the previous inks that I did, these were the Diamine Forever inks, also a pigmented ink, they seem like they tend to stay wetter longer on copy paper. A lot of inks just absorb into the paper and it sometimes won't even smear at all on copy paper. It, you know, depends ink to ink, but it seems that pigmented inks are more prone to smearing because they don't just soak up into the paper like most you know, non-pigmented inks tend to do on copy paper. Now as far as the hues of the inks, I will say this. It probably looks a little bit more prominent. When I look in the viewfinder of the camera, there's a bit more contrast. I think that has to do with the maybe color correction or just how it works. But myself sitting here, the yellow right here is a little bit hard. I mean, I can read it if I look at it, but I could see some people, especially if, you know, you maybe somebody that has glasses, maybe has a little harder time seeing things. For some people, I would say that this yellow zebra, would be illegible on a white paper. I'm just going to say that right now. Because right here, I mean, I can read it, but in poor lighting or something, like this would potentially be hard to read. Maybe on a colored or toned paper, this being a pigmented ink, I think it would still show up pretty good. So if you have like maybe a gray paper or possibly black paper, I don't really have any black paper to test. You know, this might be a good in that situation. Now, as far as art, if you're using this as an accent color, it's a combination with other inks that would set the color off. You know, that's a different application. But for writing, I think this yellow zebra here is too light for most people in most situations. That being said, if you were inclined to use these inks on copy paper, they're perfectly adequate to do so. And next is going to be the 50-pound Blick white sulfite drawing paper. And now here is the 50-pound Blick white sulfite drawing paper. Alright, so that does it for the Blick 50-pound white sulfite paper. Well, the ink performed even better on this than it did on the copy paper, which is no surprise. Now, out of all the art papers that I'm about to show, the 3 art papers I'm going to show today, this is technically the least of the copy paper, so to speak. It's the you know, the worst, if you want to call it that. It's not necessarily meant for ink. I think it's just meant for more for dry media, but it does work with a lot of inks. Now, it is showing up a little bit more shading, definitely in the purple. So that violet lion definitely shades. So I don't know if that's going to show up too well on the camera. There's a couple places, especially towards the end of the strokes, like before I was lifting the pen, I guess when I was slowing down, getting to the end of the stroke, it was putting down a little bit more ink, and there's definitely some shading there. I don't really see any shading at all, hardly that I can, maybe slightly on like the EF here. There's barely any that I can really see on the pink owl. I can see some shading in the green panda here. In several places, the W, the T, the cross and the F, cross and the T. Not as much, and then the EF here, definitely in that print EF. Definitely some shading. And as far as the yellow zebra there, like I said, it's showing up. Looks like there's more contrast on the camera than there is me looking at it here on the paper, but it's very light, like I said, and probably just due to the fact that to the naked eye, there's not a lot of contrast with the paper, not as much, like I said, as there is on the camera. But I can't see any discernible shading. Like I said, this is a little bit hard. This is the hardest ink on this page to read. Like I said, I can read it with my eyes, but even with my eyes not, being my eyesight being pretty good up close, I should say, I can't see any discernible shading. That being said, did it bleed on the back? No, it didn't. I didn't expect it to. I mean, there's no ghosting or anything. Now, as far as the dry time, honestly, it looks about the same as it was on the copy paper for the most part. 7 seconds on the Violet Lion. Looks like maybe just slightly 8 seconds on the Pink Octopus, or excuse me, the Pink Owl. On the Green Panda, maybe 5 seconds. It's a little hard to tell there. And on the, it's even harder to tell on the Yellow Zebra, but it's either, it looks like 5 seconds. So roughly the same dry times as it is with the copy paper. I think really with these pigmented inks, the dry time is more dependent on the binder that is used in the composition of the ink than like how typical fountain pen inks dry. So I think your dry time is more going to be dependent on the time it takes for the binder in the pigment ink to actually bind and set on the page. So I think, I could be wrong, but you should have a more consistent dry time with these types of inks. I'm not going to say that's definitively the case, but I think it's more likely that you're going to have a more consistent dry time on various papers with a pigment ink than you will with, more traditional inks. Or at least with the having tested a couple here, and in the past having used some tested and tried out a few of the Diatramentis document inks, they seem to be a little bit more consistent in that way. We'll see. The next two papers that I'm going to test are generally speaking have longer dry times usually, so we'll see on those. But as far as on this paper, just like on the copy paper, I don't see anything acting funny. These actually seem to be some very well-behaved inks on the paper. And so now, with that being said, we're going to move on to the Koh-i-Noor 50-pound sketch paper. And now here we are with the 50-pound Koh-i-Noor sketch paper. £50 Koh-i-Noor sketch paper. And I will say one thing I'm going to have to correct right off the bat. I said a minute ago that I thought the dry time was mostly related to the binder. Well, it looks like most of these inks on this page took several more seconds to dry. Looks like 8 seconds on the purple, 9 seconds on the pink, 9 seconds on the green, and it's hard to tell on that yellow, but it looks like at least 6 seconds, maybe more. So it's very hard to tell, because honestly, of all three papers so far, maybe it's because the surface is different and it's reflecting more of the light from my lights right here, but it's actually hardest to see this yellow on this paper out of the three I've done so far. Like I said, I think that might be the surface here being a slightly more reflective. It has a different surface finish to this paper. it's actually harder to discernibly see the yellow ink on this page. Now, as far as how the inks performed, they performed great on this paper. I expected them to. Actually, I have yet to have a fountain pen that performs poorly on this paper. Every ink that I've used on this paper has performed spectacular. There is definitely a lot more shading now in this violet. Like, the ends where there's shading is definitively darker. Like, it is very noticeable that there is shading in that violet ink. On the pink, there's still, I mean, there's a little bits, like, you gotta look real close, kind of concentrate on it pretty hard. It's not obvious. There's not really a lot of obvious shading on that pink. There is shading in the green here. Noticeable on the dots of the eyes. On the T's especially, you can see it. Once again, the E and the F really show off the shading. I don't know why those two letters at the end always show off more shading than everything else, but they do. I guess it has to do with how I write. You can see the top of this green, the word green here, the top of that G is very light. The rest of the word's actually pretty dark. So a lot of shading in that green. And once again, like I said, the contrast between the white of the paper and this yellow in particular, I can't make out any perceptible shading on that ink. Like I said, once again, for general writing, it would have to be some kind of a different tone of paper. White paper, I would not suggest that yellow for general writing. For artwork purposes, you're perfectly fine because you'll be using it in conjunction with other colors, most likely, which will help it stand out and pop as an accent. But for writing, it's you know, it's a little too light, in my opinion. Now, as far as the back, nothing has bled through. I have never had an ink bleed through this paper. Now, this is a thin paper for a 50-pound paper. It feels like a parchment paper, but it is not at all an absorbent paper. And so it is very ink resistant. This paper here handles ink very well. Now, but yeah, there's the there's those inks on this paper. Perfectly fine. And now we're going to move on to the last paper, which is the 98-pound Canson mixed media paper. And here's our final paper for this test. This is the Canson 98-pound mixed media paper. Alright, that's going to take care of finishing up the last of the writing test on the Canson 98-pound mixed media paper. Now, I'm going to say this right now. That purple pen started giving me some problems. I started having some flow issues. So there's going to be some kind of skipping and things in the writing here. That, unfortunately, seems to be an issue with that pen. I was having some issues with this pen on the prior test. I did some nib tuning. I thought I had corrected that issue, but unfortunately it has reared its ugly head. Now, I will say that there's a caveat here that, you know, these are pigmented inks, so maybe I'm starting to have some clogging in this pen, but the last time that I filled this pen, I thought I was having some flow issues with it. Up until that point, it had never really given me issues. I did a little bit of tuning. I thought I had it fixed. I'm having flow issues again. I'm going to chalk that up to the pen itself. Also, because I'm using the same model pen on two of the other inks, and I'm not having flow issues, and I'm not having flow issues with this. And these should all function pretty close to one another as far as flow and feed and all. So I'm going to chalk that up to the pen. So there's going to be a little bit of some maybe not so great looking stuff on this purple. That's largely due to the flow issues that started to happen when I was writing this sample. That being said, if you look around the spots where there are skips, it looks good on this paper. There's no there's no feathering. There's no blotting, no funniness. I wouldn't expect it. This is not at all an absorbent paper. It's a mixed media paper. It's made for all kinds of wet media, including things like watercolors. You know, it's not a dedicated watercolor paper, but you can do watercolors on this mixed media paper. And so I didn't expect it to do anything funny. Definitely, though, there are a couple places where I had to double over some lines, but there's, once again, definitely shading in the purple there. It looks like on the smear test, about 9 seconds, it was still wet, consistent with the Koh-i-Noor, and really only about 1 second off. I think this one has been 8 seconds on most of the paper, that purple there. Now on the pink, if I look real close, I can see a few spots where there is some shading, not a lot. Once again, a few places here and there at the end of some of the pen strokes. It's kind of hard to make out, though. It's not really obvious shading. You have to get real close to even notice it. But once again, no feathering, no blotting, no funny stuff. Perfectly fine on this paper, as expected. The green here, definitely shading. I say this, it's probably shaded more on this paper than it has on any of the other papers. Not quite as much as the purple, but you can see the T in that octopus, very obvious shading. F and L in fluids here, also the F there, very obvious shading. Top of the W, dot of the I, T and E, and also down here, T and E. We've got some definite shading. And then down here on the E and F, you can see some shading. So, pretty consistent with what we've seen on the other papers. Once again, no funny stuff, no feathering, no odd things that we don't want to see. Smear, looks like it was about 9 seconds on the smear there. And I forgot to mention that on the pink. Looks like it was also a 9-second on the smear. And then we get on to the yellow. Far as I can tell, there's no feathering or funny stuff on the yellow here. But like I said on the other papers, it's still not very much of a contrast between it and the white of the paper, so I can't perceive any kind of shading or tone variation whatsoever, just because there's not a lot of contrast between the ink itself and the paper. It still, like I said, is a little bit more... There's more contrast on the camera screen right now that I can see, but to the naked eye, myself, still, for a lot of people, I would say that this yellow would be hard to read, so I would not suggest using this for writing on a white paper. And this Canson mixed media paper is no different there. As far as the smear test, once again, it's very hard to tell. Looks like for sure 5 seconds or so. It probably is about 8 seconds, but the smear's so light, if it is there, I can't even see. So, and as far as on the back, there's nothing on the back. This is a 98-pound paper. It's about the same weight as a lot of cardstock, and unlike a lot of cardstock, this is far less absorbent than most cardstock, because this is a true mixed media paper. So I didn't expect to see any kind of ghosting or bleeds or anything like that on the back side, and we didn't get it. Overall, it works perfectly fine on this paper, and really, for what you would use this kind of ink for, this is the kind of paper, if I end up getting a bottle of these inks, this is the kind of paper that I am probably going to be using these types of inks on to do an art piece. Especially if you have other types of wet media that you want to use with this paper. Very much the kind of paper I would be using. So this is, you know, the ideal kind of performance that I would want to see. And now, real quick, I want to take a look at a chromatography that I did. These are some pieces of some white coffee filter paper that I cut into strips. I put a line of ink down, and I dipped these papers into a mixture of 70% isopropyl alcohol and water, mixed at about a 1/3 solution. And as you can see with most of these inks, and this is the case I've seen with a lot of not only permanent inks tend to be this way, but the pigment inks I've all done chromatographies on so far, is that pretty much you're just going to see one consistent pigment that as it goes up the paper just gets lighter. Now this, for some reason in the viewfinder, it looks like it's almost blue. I mean, obviously that's the viewfinder screen here. This is the violet. It's not blue, it's purple, and as it kind of gets lighter, as it whipped up the page, it almost favors towards a pink. So I don't know how that's going to turn out on like an actual computer screen, all things considered, but in person, if it looks blue on the screen, I assure you, it's a pinky purple in person, and it's pretty much a consistent shade throughout for the most part. And all these other ones, here's the green Panda. It almost looks yellow here in person, but once again, it's a very distinct shade, or just a very consistent shade, a single shade. There's not multiple colors here. Here's the pink owl, same again, consistently pink all the way up the paper, and the yellow zebra also consistently yellow. So there's not really the colored pigments. It's not like a mix of colors to get a specific color of the ink. It's just that color of pigment, and there doesn't seem to be any other component colors making up these inks. Just consistently. So if you go to do a wash with these, assuming you can get on them, maybe you're working on a piece of, I don't know, Bristol board or something, they're still wet, you want to wash over them, or you want to dilute them, don't expect to see multiple colors come out of your inks. They should just wash and just thin out and become a lighter shade of the color that they are, I would say. And also, I will note this, there is a very distinct line that has set into each one of these papers. I tried to put the line down and then immediately get these papers into the chromatography solution. So from that, I can say these should be quite water resistant fairly quickly. And that is what we're going to do next. Next, we're going to do a quick water test. All right, here's going to be our water test. Now I'm going to take each of the pens. I'm going to draw a little grid square. As you can see, I've already did some water tests on this paper. On here, this is a 20-pound copy paper. I'm going to let that sit for 30 seconds, timed with a stopwatch. Then I'm going to take a pipette. I'm going to drip some water on that, wait another 10 seconds, rub that water in, and then dab it off with a paper towel to see if any water smears and if any of the ink, or excuse me, if any of the ink smears, and to see if any of the ink lifts onto the paper towel. All right. All right. That's going to do it for our water test. Now, on the paper, I don't really see that I could tell that there was anything where any of the colors may have wanted to run or smear at all. Seems like they were pretty well set into the paper. The only one that maybe seems like it kind of sort of wanted to lift, possibly. I feel like there's just a hint. I don't even think it's going to show up. There might be a hint of some of the purple, but I think what that might actually be, if you look at the paper, if it just show, I don't know how well it's going to pick up. I actually think when I was rubbing in the water, I got a little too aggressive, and I actually broke up some of the fiber on the paper. I don't think it actually caused the ink to run or bleed or lifted the ink. I think I actually accidentally rubbed some of the top layer of fiber off. It may not show up on the camera, but I can see it looking at it that that's what happened, because I can see strings of the paper fibers coming up. So I'm not going to say that was the ink lifting, especially considering I don't see any kind of indicators that the ink ran whatsoever. on the prior test I did with these last inks, there was a little bit of movement that can be seen on the paper that was also corroborated by some ink lifting onto this towel. But here, I think pretty much after 30 seconds, these inks here were pretty well set in this paper, and I don't think they were going to go anywhere. And I think if you gave them any longer than just the 30 seconds to dry, yeah, I think they're pretty well there. Now on something like that mixed media paper, I would probably give it a little bit longer. And just in general, say I was going to use watercolors or something with an ink, I usually especially with watercolors, I usually leave an inked drawing to set for a few hours, if not leave it for a day or more. Especially with some of the Noodler's inks that I have, they're the cellulose reactive inks. They take longer to chemically bond to the paper. With these inks, though, these pigmented inks, once that binder dries and sets and it, sort of binds the pigment to the paper, they should be pretty well set. And it looks like with these write and draw inks, 30 seconds or less and you're ready to go. At least on the copy paper. You'd have to do tests on some other media for art purposes, but yes, they do indeed look to be quite water resistant, or I would say waterproof. So that's going to be it for the test portions of this video. Now, as far as my final opinions so far, I really like what I see. Now, I did not obviously get all of the inks. I can't remember. I didn't actually count them, but I think it's like 28 inks or so in this series. I think for every color you can think of, there's at least 2 colors in this series. I know there's 2 yellows. The other yellow was like a dandelion yellowish, more yellow orange. I think there's 3 greens. There's at least 4 blues. I think like 3 or 4 shades of red. There's a kind of red violet that's more purpley, or like a red violet here, and then there's some more red toned pinks and things. So there's a bunch of inks in the series. Obviously I don't have them all here, but you can pretty much find a shade of ink that you like in this series. They even have a petrol ink. So if you've ever seen like the Lamy petrol ink, well, they have a pigmented version of sort of that petrol color. It's actually kind of cool. Actually, I think they've got 2 slightly different shades of that. So there are tons of inks in this series of ink. And obviously I can't say because I haven't tried them all, but I would say because these seem to be pretty consistent amongst the 4 samples I have, I would say that the properties of these 4 are fairly similar to what you'd see in the other inks. And I'm going to be doing a test once. I've got 4 more inks I'm going to put on the papers that I was writing on today in the ink sample. And I'm going to use them to do, once that ink test is done, I'm going to take the papers that I've written on, the 4 papers today, and I'm going to do a light fastness test with them where I cut those papers in half, take one half of that paper, tape it up in a window, exposed to the sun, leave it there for a month, take the other papers, put it in a folder, stick it up on my shelf out of the sun, and then after a month, bring the 2 papers in, compare them side by side to see if any fading occurs with these inks, to see just how light fast they are. So that's a test to look towards in the future. But if they are, and I think that they should be light fast, like these, I think these are really good if you're an artist. I think these are really good art inks from just what I've seen so far. But yeah, I could definitely see myself using colors like this for artwork. And I think, like I said, this is a write and draw is what they call it. So I think that's really what these are geared towards. Now, that is also another thing, if you're watching this video wondering about potentially using these as a daily writer ink. There are quirks you have to think about, or quirks or features, I guess you would say, potentially negatives you have to think about when using a pigmented ink. if you're going to use a pigmented ink, you should not leave that ink in any particular pen for an extended period of time. If for some reason you're not regularly using that pen, you don't want to store that pen with the ink in it. You want to empty the ink out of the pen, and then you want to flush that pen and clean it, because you do not want a pigmented ink drying in your pen. The binders in the pigments in these types of ink will just essentially bind that pigment, particularly into the feed, and sort of solidify. And in some cases, it can make it where you will never get that ink out of that feed, and it can potentially ruin a pen. So that's something that you do have to take into account. That's the big downside with using a pigmented ink. And some pens, pigmented inks can tend to clog them. I really didn't have any flow issues with these towards the end, this particular pen, but I've kind of decided that is in this pen. But yeah, some pens can be problematic with flowing and feeding pigmented inks. So that's one thing to be aware of. And like I said, because you don't want to deal with having these inks dry in a pen, you want to make sure you put them in a pen that seals good, has a good cap seal. So if you've got a pen that has a dubious cap seal that kinds to dry out pretty quickly, don't put a pigmented ink in it. That's the last thing you want to do. That could end up very bad. Also, I wouldn't suggest putting pigmented inks in valuable pens, because obviously if they did dry out, you don't want to damage, cause permanent damage or potentially ruin a valuable pen because of using an ink that, a higher maintenance ink like this. But that being said, on the papers that one would typically use for artistic purposes, and being as that is probably the primary draw for using an ink like this, from what I've seen with these 4 inks and the little testing bits that I've done so far, these seem like great inks for that purpose. Just keep in mind, pigment inks are higher maintenance. Don't put them in a valuable pen. Don't store them for long periods in a pen. And when you empty the pen, make sure to clean and flush that pen well. So, with all that having been said, I hope that those of you who watch this, especially if you watched it all the way to the end, I really thank you, because I know this is going to be a bit of a marathon of a video. My videos tend to run a little bit long. And if you got something out of this, it was informative to you, I would really appreciate it if you'd hit that thumbs up button. That would really help me out. And so that's all I got for this video. I thank you for watching, and I hope to catch you in the next one. Bye.